Thousands of North Korean troops are headed to the Ukraine war. Putin is doing additional nuclear preparations and exercises, talking and brandishing his nuclear missiles. Are we escalation, or is this possibly even part of the drawdown situation where the war could possibly come to an end? That remains to be seen, but we're going to have somebody with us great today to help us unpack some of this stuff and make sense out of a lot of confusing issues that are going on out there. And that's Colonel Doug Macgregor, retired, highly decorated Army combat veteran, CEO of Our Country, Our Choice, and great sage on all things going on, especially in Europe. Doug, welcome back to the show.
Good to be with you.
Well, listen, let's just jump right in there because there's more. At first, there was just lots of claims that the North Koreans were in the area, and some people were admitting it. Some people were denying it, saying it's not true. Now it looks like that more and more sources, really on all sides of this, are all saying the same thing, that there are some North Korean troops heading into the area. Here's what Pat Ryder said at a press conference yesterday.
We believe that the DPRK has sent approximately 10,000 soldiers in total to train in eastern Russia, and that these troops will probably augment Russian forces near Ukraine over the next several weeks. A portion of those soldiers have already moved closer to Ukraine towards Russia's Kursk Oblast near the border with Ukraine, approximately a couple thousand, with a smaller number already present in the Kursk region. So we've seen the relationship further deepening between the DPRK and Russia, which is of course concerning, to include the provision of munitions from North Korea to Russia to aid in their war effort. I think, as Secretary Austin highlighted, however, though, this is an indication of the dire situation that Russia finds itself in terms of manpower on the front lines.
Does it really indicate that Russia is in a dire situation with manpower, though, Russia? Doug, how do you view the insertion of these Russian troops, Ukrainian, North Korean troops?
Hey, listen, it's been an interesting 24 hours because Dan, that I've been to Korea, the Republic of Korea, and I have friends there. And, young Kim, who is probably one of the smartest people I've ever met, works closely with me in these matters. And we've been searching everywhere, high and low. Finally, this morning, in frustration, because I couldn't find any evidence of any kind of North Korean soldiers or officers or anything anywhere near Ukraine. They are all in eastern Siberia. That's quite clear. That's the one thing that General Ryder said that is absolutely true. And they've been training up there on a routine basis forever. But we haven't found any evidence for this crazy notion that either Russia needs augmentation. There's no evidence for that whatsoever. And secondly, that they would want to try and incorporate Korean troops into the fight. And again, the Koreans are not fluent in Russian. The Russians aren't fluent in Korean. The people that train with the Koreans out in eastern Siberia obviously have learned to speak Korean, but this is ridiculous. So we've tried. I actually talked to Larry Johnson. I said, Larry, have I lost my mind? He said, no. And he made a point that I think is very valid. He said that this story originated in the New York Times from David Sanger, who is, a well-known source for the CIA. In other words, the CIA pitches the narrative to him. He reproduces it in print. I think it's a big lie. And this is a last-ditch attempt to get everybody involved in something that no one really wants anything to do with in Europe, which is war with Russia and Ukraine. The only other thing that I can think of, Dan, that your audience might want to consider is that out of a population of 140 million, there are as many as perhaps 20 million Russian citizens who are of Mongolian or Tatar or Turkic ancestry. They are in Russian forces. Some of them are in formations with people much like themselves, but they're fully assimilated into the Russian mainstream. Perhaps they are looking at some of them and thinking this is true. It just strikes me as a huge, huge lie right now.
Well, and I want to go down the practical part of that, because most people, especially people who are not experts in military affairs, will just think, oh, you just add 10,000 troops. Cool, that'll be fine. But I remember back when you and I fought together in Desert Storm, when that big coalition, I remember there was some issues with the Egyptian army that was not far from one of our flanks. And we had an issue where we were concerned that we might actually clash with the Egyptians at one point, and how difficult it was to manage something where you have different systems and different languages. How hard would it be for Russia to actually incorporate North Korean troops if they wanted to?
Well, actually, I think at the time, Dan, it was a Syrian force that was on the ground, which at that time, the Syrian army was, of the various Arab contingents, probably the best. And there was some concern that we could accidentally get into trouble. Language barriers are enormous. It's not just language barriers, it's also cultural. People don't know each other, they don't understand each other, and they assume the worst about each other. So I cannot conceive of anybody in the Russian high command who wants to bring in thousands of Korean troops. It's ridiculous. It's unnecessary. They are not lacking for manpower. That's part of the big, utterly false narrative that is perpetrated over and over and over again. I'm getting tired of it, but I'm afraid that it's going to continue until the Russians decide to either cross the river, go into Kiev and root out the regime and be done with it, or somebody wises up and recognizes that the Ukrainian state is destroyed and the people that live in the Western Ukrainian area deserve to be rescued from destruction. But nobody seems to be very concerned about them.
Yeah, we had on our show a former UK citizen who actually decided to fight for the Russian side and was on the front lines in the Kupiansk area. And we asked him that question when this first came out about North Koreans. He said, well, I haven't seen or even heard about any, but he said, we have no shortage of personnel. We got all the weapons, ammunition, and personnel we can use. It's a tough fight, he said. And there were high casualties on both sides, he said, but there was no shortage of Russian troops on there. So, and that was in one of the maybe the third or fourth most important front line that the Russians have. But I think to your point a second ago that this is being used as potentially something to try and draw the West in. Here's what Zelensky said just yesterday.
Tests, yes, in English. Tests, yes, tests. He tries how it works, how West will react. The same with North Korea soldiers. I had meetings with leaders, a lot of different leaders, and NATO and etc. And I said to them that this is very dangerous, and I think that we need strong reaction on it. Till now, we heard some reaction, but it's not strong enough.
Now, that suits his purpose. He certainly wants there to be a reaction. But as you said from your sources there, you haven't yet to see any evidence of North Korean troops on the line fighting alongside of Russians. I've also heard other reports, I have not been able to confirm, that there are some in the administration that are saying if the North Korean troops actually do engage, then Biden may drop the prohibition about long-range weapons being fired into Russia. How do you view that?
Well, if that's going to be the excuse, then we're going to find ourselves inevitably in a direct confrontation with Russia, because the Russian government is not going to stand idly by and watch us provide Ukrainians with dangerous strike weapons that can kill large numbers of Russians in their cities. And contrary to popular belief, whereas the Russians have worked tirelessly to try and avoid civilian casualties, we know from experience that if you give the Ukrainians anything in terms of a long-range strike weapon, they will very definitely use it against populated areas. So this would be catastrophic at this stage. There's no way to win this war. It doesn't matter what we do. The war is lost. Russia has won. People are simply dying every day as the Russians slowly but deliberately push forward. That's all there is. And somehow or another, Americans and people in Western Europe need to develop a filter. They need to develop some sort of detection device that helps them understand when they're being lied to. And that's what's happening right now. The lies are even more gargantuan and more horrific now than they were at the beginning of this nonsense. I'm waiting for the ghost of Kiev to magically put himself back into a fighter jet and fly to Moscow. It's absurd.
Well, now I want to ask you one more question related. There's one other thing that Zelensky said in that press conference that definitely got my radar perked up when he was talking about not only is he still using that to your point there, ridiculous comment about a so-called victory plan, but he's still trying to get not just long-range weapons, but he claims that someone leaked a private conversation about tomahawks.
When I asked them in the victory plan to give me the package of long-distance weapon, and we will use it only if Russia will not stop the war and will not stop continuing escalation, I said, this is a prevention method. They said to me, this is escalation. When a lot of countries began to support victory plan, you see what's going on now in media, they said that Ukraine wants or wanted a lot of missiles like Tomahawk and etc. And but it was confidential information between Ukraine and White House. How to understand these messages? So it means between partners there is no any confidential things.
Doug, why in the world would we even be talking to Ukraine about giving them Tomahawk missiles, which are, correct me if I'm wrong, but nuclear capable missiles?
Of course. First of all, I think it's pretty clear that Zelensky, who's a brilliant actor, also has a death wish for himself and his country. Because if he even thinks about proceeding down this road, that is exactly what will happen. And I think President Putin has made that clear. I don't think we have a death wish in this country. In fact, I know of nobody who is in the electorate who thinks that we should die to help or support or assist this man Zelensky. I think right now the general attitude is that if we are going to get any more money for Tennessee and North Carolina, we rename them Ukraine and Israel. I mean, this is the joke that is everywhere now. It's disgusting. It's black humor. You know, Dan, I don't have a good answer other than to say the man is either delusional or just a brilliant actor, but there's no chance of any of that happening. And I don't think the lunatics that he thinks are in Washington are all in Washington. I think most of them are in Kiev. And I think the few people in Washington that talk about these things are just talking, have no intention of delivering, because they know what that could mean. And that would lead to a confrontation with Russia.
Now, I certainly hope that's the case, but given the evidence that exists in related categories, I'm not sure how smart some of our people in Washington actually are. At a press conference yesterday, one of the other things that was asked about General Ryder was they're saying, hey, you know, with all these missiles we keep sending to Ukraine and now even more missiles, or especially interceptors, we're sending to Israel, is there any chance that we could be running low? Watch his answer.
Is there any shortage that is being faced either by the Pentagon or the Navy in terms of these interceptor missiles? There are reports, Wall Street Journal is reporting that there is a shortage. Is that true?
Yeah, I've seen the press reports, as I'm sure you can appreciate. I'm not going to talk about our readiness levels or stockpiles other than to say, as evidenced by decades and decades of global force management, I think we do a pretty good job of managing our capabilities around the world to ensure that we have what we need, where we need it to support not only our operations plans, but also crises and contingencies. And we've demonstrated that on multiple occasions throughout the Middle East, whether it's supporting the defense of Israel, protecting the freedom of navigation in the Red Sea, or addressing threats throughout the Middle East and other places. So, you know, we have always made conscious decisions about how to best manage those forces around the world and manage our readiness levels. But needless to say, we are ready and prepared to support our requirements in support of our national security interests.
You know, it's funny, Doug, he says, yeah, needless to say, we have all the missiles we need to meet all of our requirements. But 1 month ago, you had the National Security Advisor, Jake Sullivan, sang a different tune.
Ukraine was running short of air defense interceptors. So I sat down with my team and I said, where are we sending Patriot missiles and AMRAAM missiles around the world in the next 12 months? And I was told there's a whole list of countries we're sending them to. And I said, take every single one of those missiles, every one, and send them to Ukraine. That was not an easy thing to do. It required us to get our allies and partners to come along. Frankly, it required our bureaucracy to come along. And we are currently working on a substantial package, pulling together a range of different capabilities that we are going to try to get out the door before the end of this month.
So who's telling the truth? Is it Ryder saying, "Yeah, we got it enough, don't worry about it," or is it Jake Sullivan saying, "Man, we got so few right now, we're having to rape them from other people, and we've used a lot since then"? How do you see it?
Well, I think Jake Sullivan accidentally told the truth and gave you a glimpse of the true situation. Ryder reminds me of the Secretary of the Treasury, Mellon, in June of 1929, when he was asked about the dangers of a stock market crash because of all the purchasing of stocks on margin. And he dismissed it and said, "We live in an era of unbroken prosperity," and went on to tell everyone everything was safe. Of course, at the same time, he was liquidating all of his stock, turning everything into cash and gold. Ryder is just a mouthpiece. That's all he is. You could put a robot in his place, dress him up as a major general in a blue uniform, and let him spout the same thing. That's his job. That's what he's paid to say. That's all there is to it. He's not paid to analyze. He's not paid to think. He's not paid to reconsider. He's paid to repeat the line. Whatever the narrative is, that's what he does. But it's false. And we know it's false because of Sullivan, and Sullivan gave us a good glimpse. Now, the real question is, if we are stupid enough to provide these kinds of things to the Ukrainians that could precipitate a confrontation with Russia, what are we going to do in the Middle East? Because I predict that before the year is out, Jake Sullivan will be saying something quite similar about Israel, that we're sending everything we've got to Israel because they've used it up. And we're going to use up most of our stocks, and our stocks are not limitless at all. And remember, most of these missiles are going to be fired from ships that are anti-missiles, part of the air and missile defense structure. These have to be reloaded in ports. You have to have a lot of missiles on hand. We don't. We just don't. We've never. I know he says we've done a brilliant job of global management, but I can tell you right now from personal experience back in 1998 and 99, that's not true. We always had excess in one area and a poverty of missiles in another. We haven't done a brilliant job. So I think it's just nonsense.
Well, so let me ask you, Doug, what is in America's interest here? And what as best you can divine the actual intent of the administration or the Pentagon, if those are separate, because we see they know the real number. They know that we're running short there, and they see that the insatiable appetite that both Israel and Ukraine has, and they see our small stockpile, and they see our ability to create more. There's a delta there that just is not going to be met. Why then would we not want to say, all right, let's just get this wrapped up and get this off the table and move on to whatever's next, instead of keeping the fiction going, because there are tangible consequences to that?
Well, keep in mind the last round at Ramstein, where the various contributors to the money pot and the equipment pot, technology pot from NATO was canceled. Remember?
Yeah.
They didn't bother getting together. The well is almost dry. The Germans have said categorically it's over. We're not sending anything more. The truth is we haven't got a lot to send. And any rational person, and of course, I think there are some out there, would say this is not the time to provoke a wider war under any circumstances. Certainly not in Ukraine, and hopefully not in the Middle East, because we're not prepared for it. Have we seen any deliberate mobilization of industry here inside the United States to do much? Not really. I mean, when you make a decision to confront a major power in the world, whether you do it directly or through a proxy, you tend to shift gears and go into high production. We really haven't done that. I mean, we're doing better now in artillery, hard shell artillery ammunition than we did in the past, but it's a fraction of what could be required if we have to confront a major power. So I just think it's nonsense. But keep in mind, for the people in Washington that are managing or orchestrating this disaster, they see this as their last attempt to hold on to global military hegemony. Remember, everything is global. When you talk to these people, well, our global military strategy, our global this, our global that, it's part of the narcissism that goes with being the world's great superpower. You don't hear other people in other countries talk about global anything. You hear them talk about, We've got to trade with our neighbors. We've got to trade with these people. We've got to be prepared to fight in this region or that region. But nobody talks in global terms. Only we do. We're so overstretched at this point. We've stretched our finances, our resources, our people to the point of breaking. It's going to come apart. The wheels are going to come off. I just hope they don't come off at a point in time where we put ourselves unnecessarily at risk and we look ridiculous in the eyes of the world. But that's where we're headed.
Well, and I think that when you look at the actual battlefield in Ukraine, things are not merely trending in that direction, but accelerating, I think. And we've been talking about a lot about how the tactical advances of the Russians are now advancing 2 to 5 kilometers per day now, not just mere hundreds of meters in some place like it was from the earlier part of the year. The Ukraine army is continuing to just get ground down. And there's lots of additional reports about not only a difficulty in recruiting more people, but in getting those that they press gang off the street to actually fight is proving even more difficult. And they're showing up without any much training at all. But on the other side of that line, you have the Russians seem to be increasing in their strength. There was an interview earlier today on Nima, one of the folks actually we're going to be on later this afternoon, talking to a retired Russian colonel who was talking about, he was asked about, is Russia going to do something big? Because there's been lots of talk, you and I have talked about it before, that we've been kind of surprised that Russia hasn't gone with a big push as opposed to this methodical push. And he was asked today, can Russia do that? And why haven't they so far? What's his answer?
That's why, Nima, we're not in a hurry. We're taking a wholesome approach when military actions are tied to both economic actions and both to actions on diplomatic front.
Мы один фиг победим.
We will win. We will prevail in any way. We're always considering an escalation possible, and we continuously work to avoid it and deter it by the diplomatic means.
Я напомню о договоре с Корейской Народно-Демократической Республикой.
I should remind you of the accords with Northern Republic of Northern Korea.
А до этого было совершенно неожиданное для Запада наращивание военно-технического сотрудничества с Ираном.
And before that, we had a steadily improved cooperation with Iran.
Россия наследники и изощренной византийской традиции.
Russia is a heir to the complicated Byzantium traditions.
Поступать с врагами коварно и неожиданно.
Handling enemies with wit and surprise.
Мы легко обманем, что и происходит.
We can fool them around, what we're doing.
Мы поступим неожиданно.
We would do something which would surprise them all.
So he's implying there and elsewhere in that conversation, he was implying that Russia fights different than the West. They don't fight the same way with this shock and all kind of stuff that we, create this image that that's how we do war. And since Russia hasn't done that, then they're not going to succeed. But he implied there at the asked that maybe something bigger is coming in, that there could be a surprise coming. How do you see that?
I suppose that's possible. We have to understand that President Putin, from the very beginning, has been cautious and deliberate. He's held back a great deal of capability and military power because he was never completely sure that he might not have to fight NATO. And I think we need to keep that in mind. If you go back and look at the remarks that are being made by Biden and other leaders in the West over the last almost 3 years, we've really given the Russians a case to prepare for war against us. So I think that's in the back of everybody's mind over there. What do we do if suddenly there's a massive influx of high-end conventional military power, aircraft, weapons, ships, everything into the theater from the United States, Great Britain, Germany, France, and so forth? Now, I think the probability of that now is lower than it has ever been, but it was quite high some time ago. So some of that caution, if you will, is a consequence of that. As far as delivering a surprise, I don't know. There are lots of people. Listen, you talk to people that know the Russians, and one of the things they always say is that whatever you think they're going to do, they don't. And what you did not think would happen, happens. Russia is that kind of place. Now, I am not a Russophile. I am not fluent in Russian, although I wish that I had studied it, never had a chance to really sink my teeth into it. But one of the things that you learn from the Russians is that unlike the Westerners, the Germans, the French, the Americans, they are not without patience. And, there's this old Chinese proverb, stand by the river long enough and eventually the bodies of your enemies will float by you. I think that's the Russian view right now of what's happening in Europe.
And I've had some sources this morning that tell me that there have been increasing reports, especially from Telegram and some other sources, that Russia has been producing a great deal of new tanks, T-80s, T-90s, or a moderate amount, not a great deal, a moderate amount, but they have been refurbishing lots of T-64s, T-72s, like in the low thousands. But the much smaller number of those have actually been employed, implying that a lot of these, not implying, saying that a lot of these have been seen on rail cars moving more toward the Russian border with Ukraine, but they haven't actually gone in, implying that they're building up for something that could come in big. Do you think Russia actually has the capacity to do that?
I think Russia has the capacity to march to the Polish border. I've always said that. That's not something they want to do. They absolutely do not want to share a border with NATO. They would much prefer that Western Ukraine be neutral. I think President Putin has made that clear. So has Foreign Minister Lavrov. Everyone has made that clear. But they have convinced themselves that there's no one to talk to, at least for the moment. And until they find evidence that someone with a rational mind is going to stand up and say, we need to end this travesty, stop the killing, as much as President Trump has said, until he arrives, the Russians are going to continue on the current path. And that means they're going to be prepared to cross that river, go into Kiev, and march all the way to the Polish border. They've got to do it. They've got to accept the fact that that may be unavoidable. That's all that's going on. I would not say there's anything else more to it than that.
Now, what about there's one other piece of information or news out today is that Russia, I guess it was yesterday, and then Putin made a comment about it today, that Russia has again done an overt kind of, for everyone to see, nuclear weapons test, nuclear missile test, rather, nuclear capable missile. And then today Putin explained why he did it.
Уважаемые товарищи, добрый день. Сегодня мы проводим очередную тренировку стратегических сил сдерживания. Отработаем действия должностных лиц по управлению применением ядерного оружия с практическими пусками баллистических и крылатых ракет. Сразу отмечу, что Россия подтверждает свою принципиальную позицию о том, что использование ядерного оружия является крайней исключительной мерой обеспечения безопасности государства. Вместе с тем, мы хорошо понимаем, что именно ядерная триада продолжает оставаться надежным гарантом суверенитета и безопасности нашей страны, позволяет решать задачи стратегического сдерживания, а также поддерживать ядерный паритет и баланс сил в мире как объективные факторы глобальной стабильности. Учитывая рост геополитической напряженности, появление новых внешних угроз и рисков, важно иметь современные и постоянно готовые к боевому применению стратегические силы. Будем и дальше совершенствовать все их компоненты. Ресурсы для этого имеются. Подчеркну, мы не собираемся втягиваться в новую гонку вооружений, однако будем поддерживать ядерные силы на уровне необходимой достаточности.
So why do you think, Doug, that this is like this? I think the third, it's a similar situation that they've done this year. Why do you think that Putin felt the importance to not just do the exercise, but actually go out and say that, and then include that phrase against new emerging threats? What new threats do you think he might have in mind?
I think he's simply listening to people in the West, particularly in the United States, in the State Department, to a lesser extent the Pentagon, and what we're saying over and over and over again is that we may well support Zelensky with weapon systems and capabilities, that could threaten the Russian homeland. It's very simple. He's reinforcing, his argument from much earlier that if you're contemplating this, we are in a state of readiness to respond decisively and drastically in a way from which you will not easily recover. I mean, that's really the subtext to what he said. But understand something else. This war, as is always the case with all wars, the longer they drag on, the more dangerous, the more destructive, the more lethal they become. When we go back and we try to figure out how Ukraine may have sustained over 1 million casualties. I'm hearing somebody said 1.2 million. I don't know. And certainly at least 600,000 dead. Diametrically opposite of what is reported in the Western press. We'll probably see that most of the losses have come towards the end of the conflict. And that's usually the case as well. Just keep in mind, brigade commanders who are major generals in the Russian army, that people don't understand, a major general is essentially equivalent to a brigadier in our force structure. So you have major generals in charge of these brigades, and then you have lieutenant generals and colonel generals, only 3 levels. They have authority now to request and receive immediate support from Iskander missile batteries. Now that's a 1,500 to 2,000 pound warhead, a hypersonic missile. Whatever it finds, it destroys with absolute precision, and the consequences are enormous for the people on the receiving end. We've now seen these glide bombs used far more regularly because the air defenses have been stripped away in Western Ukraine. That means that aircraft can fly closer to the front lines and they can release these weapons that are catastrophic in the damage that they cause. 6,000 to 9,000 pound bombs with different kinds of warheads, including fuel air explosive. What I'm trying to say is that this is an army that is battle hardened, battle tested, professionally organized, and led. It has the capability to roll up the rest of the country if it is ordered to do so. That is not something that the president wants to do. He wants to end this. And he's making it very clear that if we cross this Rubicon, that he's prepared to use a tactical nuclear weapon. That's all. And we should take that very seriously. If we start attacking Russian cities, killing thousands and thousands of Russian citizens, there will be a war with Russia. I don't understand why people in Washington refuse to believe that. When this whole thing started, I remember talking to someone from the Atlantic Council, which is a disappointing organization, obviously, who said, oh, no, there won't be any war in eastern Ukraine. The Russians wouldn't dare attack. I look at these people like, what planet are you on? Do you know nothing about Russia or the Russians? This is their homeland. You think they're going to allow this cancer to metastasize on their border? Oh, nothing's going to happen. That's not what. People just don't get it. You got to listen to President Putin and Sergei Lavrov. You've got to listen to them and believe what they say. They're not bluffing. These aren't hollow phrases, empty words. Too much of what we say is nonsense. And unfortunately, it's so radical and so unbalanced that it's taken seriously beyond our borders with terrible consequences. This is the problem with the absence of real statecraft and diplomacy. We don't have any. We have a group of amateurs with bullwhips and cudgels who want to bully everybody into line.
And it's ironic
today in Israel. It's not going to work.
You see that you said listen. They should listen to Putin. They should also listen to what Zelensky is saying in that headline that Gary just showed there from I guess a couple of days ago. That they said 1,100 glide bombs had been dropped on Ukraine in just the past week, highlighting what you just said, that they don't have the air defense to block it. So Russia has virtual impunity. And I'm just thinking, when you have no air defense and you have no answer for this on the ground and the devastation this claims, why would any rational person want to keep fighting when they know there is no path to victory? There's no path to anything except ultimate military defeat. That's the part I can't get. I understand you don't want to lose. I understand you hate the Russians, etc. But at some point, you're going to get yourself completely destroyed if you don't acknowledge reality. How long do you think it might take for that to happen?
Well, remember, the puppet regime that you're talking about is extraordinarily well paid. They've enriched themselves, turned themselves into millionaires, probably 100 millionaires. That's the problem in Ukraine. The corruption dominates everything. They're going to continue to hold out their hands and steal as much as they can until the waterfall stops. In other words, they've been drinking from a fire hose in terms of cash, technology, equipment, money, whatever. Until that stops, they're going to talk in these ridiculous terms. And as soon as that stops, they're gone. They'll leave as quickly as you saw people leave Kabul. What did you see on the television? People stuffing cash into their SUVs, driving over the border to somewhere. That's what you're going to see with Zelensky and his crew, too. They don't have skin in the game. They're not being killed. They're not at the front. The people who are dying are Ukrainians that are being compelled to fight, and the few Ukrainians that sadly think they're defending something that is good. They're defending something that's evil, and that regime is corrupt and evil. We haven't even talked about the human trafficking these people are involved with, or the drugs. This is a catastrophe. We ought to get out of it, but no one in Washington cares because they're not Americans.
You know, we're going to shift over to the Middle East here in just a second because I want to talk about some related things that are going on over there. But just before coming on the air here, I've heard from a couple of sources and some other things that I've been seeing recently that's saying that the risk of a coup or turning against Zelensky is rising. Many of people apparently they're connected to those who say, hey, you're just sending our people to die for no reason, and they want to get out of it. I'm also reminded of our own experience with the recalcitrant leader that we didn't like in Vietnam during that war, where some of the people were rising up to and then did assassinate the leader of South Vietnam that we were supporting, and we were aware of it and just kind of like, yeah, that's fine, go ahead. Do you think there's a risk of that for Zelensky?
Well, I'm sure there is. I'm surprised it hasn't already happened. But he's extraordinarily well guarded. He's got foreign security, just as Maduro asked for and ultimately got in exchange for shipping gold to Russia. Security forces that consisted largely of Russians and some that were trained by the Russians to protect him from being killed. I'm sure that we've done the same thing. We've got foreigners on the ground, as well as Ukrainians, extremely well paid. Many of them are very competent, and their job is to keep him and his little band alive, come what may. And that's the problem. As long as they are there, this is going to continue.
That's what it looks like, and I guess there's really no way to hasten that day up to where they finally either wake up and do something that makes sense, or the United States does what you suggest and cut off the supply, and then they don't have any choice but to do something that makes a lot more sense. We got a big triple header coming up tomorrow. We got lots of good people. You're not going to want to miss any of those shows. Just watch our channel here. We're going to have Chaz Freeman on at 1 o'clock. Alex of History Legends, and he's got a new video that's going to be coming out on this Lebanon situation. That's going to be fabulous. You're not going to want to miss either his video or his talking about it on our show. It's kind of a world premiere kind of situation. And then another one of our fan faves, Alexander Mercurius of the Duran, on at 3 o'clock. Be sure and tune in at that. Be sure and like and subscribe if you hadn't, but you do not want to miss any of those tomorrow. See you next time on Daniel Davis Deep Dive.